Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everyone who's joined us. Good morning, all of our listeners, our subscribers, our loyal followers, and also very important good morning to our OneTrust friends and colleagues across the waters. Alexis, Amelia, and Joshua from OneTrust, thank you very, very much for making time available to spend with us today. We're very, very much looking forward to hearing and seeing some of the information you've compiled and want to share with us, and really getting a chance to ask you guys some questions about Popia, compliance, risk, governance, what's happening in this crazy landscape, quite specifically to South Africa, but also other regions of Africa. I think a lot has happened in the last while. Popia has become paramount and the forefront of so many of our daily engagements and our daily planning. We are all acutely aware of the implications of Popia. We don't always follow it. We're not quite sure what's going to happen, and we're waiting for some punitive measures to no doubt be slapped on somebody or someone at some time quite soon. However, in the meantime, I'm very, very honored to have the three of you here. Thank you so much for making this time, and we can't wait to hear what the three of you have to share with us, and also for us to be able to see some of the slides in the corner of the screen that Joshua is going to control. So Joshua heads up client engagement as the client executive, and both Alexis and Amelia work on the analysis, legals, and the privacy laws around what we're going to discuss today. So I think there's an eclectic mix of skills here and some different angles for us all to engage in. And I really encourage everybody who's on this call today to please feel free to pop questions in the chat. I will relay those questions to our guests and be able to perhaps answer them as best possible. But also, if required, and if no one wants, I would happily share those questions in an anonymous capacity. After the call, the recording will be made available, as will some elements of the slides. And of course, the details of the guests will be shared, so you're more than welcome to reach out to them yourselves. We very much look forward to this. With no further ado, I'd like to hand over to our esteemed guests. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, James. So a brief introduction, maybe a quick background from myself. As James mentioned, my name is Alexis. I work at OneTrust Data Guidance, and Data Guidance is the legal research module to OneTrust. So what we're doing on a daily basis, we are monitoring all the data protection and privacy related developments across the globe. And my team, the EMEA team, we obviously look at Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So obviously a key focus for us has been the GDPR and all developments relating to that. But also we've been seeing a lot of developments, especially recently in the last couple of years in Africa with Popia, but also with respect to a number of other countries where we've seen a lot of new requirements which businesses need to have in mind with respect to their operations and their privacy programs. Amelia, would you like to give a little introduction to yourself, and maybe we can kick off with talking about with Popia and some of the significant developments we've seen there recently?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Lex. Yeah, so as Lex mentioned, I also work in the EMEA team, and specifically I've worked on content for South Africa for the last couple of years. So seeing some of those developments with Popia coming through. So yeah, it's a really exciting time, not just for Europe, but also across privacy for Africa as well. And yeah, so significant developments happening in South Africa, not just, some of the developments that we see in the news, but also in terms of legislation. Taking that kind of approach, I think it's important to understand Popia doesn't sort of happen in a vacuum, and there is a package of laws that are coming alongside Popia at the same time. And we can see sort of the president pushing for these kind of regulations that do regulate the digital space that we are now obviously living in. So there's a few of those that I would probably highlight. Firstly, I'd probably talk a little bit about PIA. So that's the Promotion of Access to Information Act that's been around for quite a while, way before Popia was even drafted. And that regulates, obviously, access to information and has some requirements about the right of access that have been built on under Popia as well. And there's some important changes that have happened there over the last couple of years alongside Popia's commencement, importantly related to the PIA manual too. So this is a requirement that's been expanded. Before, it was just for public bodies to publish this kind of manual. that explains the information activities going on at the public body, but now it's for private bodies too. So a very wide-reaching requirement. And also now these manuals have to cover all of the information processing activities, and they hold this kind of record. And on top of all of that, they also have to be publicized as well. So it's a really interesting requirement there, and something that shouldn't be forgotten in light of everything happening with Popia. So that's the first law alongside Popia that I would highlight. The second one I would highlight is the Cybercrimes Act. So the Cybercrimes Act was originally proposed as a cybercrimes and cybersecurity bill back in 2015. And then the draft was split in two in order to sort of save some time, so that it passed quicker, and then also pass in line with Popia too. So you can see that they're quite closely aligned. And many of the sections have actually already commenced very quickly over the space of a few months. And the bulk of those sections are to do with, for example, what constitutes a crime, what constitutes an offence, and this includes cyber fraud, malicious communications, aiding and abetting. There's a very long title there. I won't say all of the adjectives they use, but aiding, abetting, cyber fraud, taking part in revenge pornography. And there's a lot of talk around that as well. And then a really important requirement, which is not fully enforced yet, but should definitely be noted, is the reporting requirement for financial institutions and also for electronic communication service providers. And that's for reporting any kind of data breach to the police, the South African police, within 72 hours, which is obviously quite a tight window. And if you don't manage to do that, that's going to be a fine of about 50,000 Rand, which is quite a hefty fine, I would say, if that happens at the rate that data breaches are happening at the moment as well. The third piece of legislation at this point, not at all commenced, it's in draft form still. I would highlight the National Data and Cloud Policy. So this was published last year, open for public consultation around April, June. And it was actually extended, the consultation as well. There are no data localization requirements under Popia itself, but as we see from many of sort of global legislations, even if there are no residency or localization requirements under the privacy law, we can see that in sectoral laws and sector-specific laws. This, for example, would be the data and cloud policy, and it would have a very large scope. And if this draft policy is passed, it would mean that companies, well, basically it calls for data sovereignty for specific types of data. So data that is classified as critical information infrastructure. And this means it can only be processed and stored within South Africa. And since the consultation closed last June, we haven't heard so much in terms of official reports about its next steps, but it is obviously a significant effort for both companies that fall under its scope and also for the government in enforcing it. So I think that's sort of the main pieces of development in terms of legislation over the last couple of years.
Thank you for making that introduction. I think it definitely outlines a lot of what we need to be made aware of. And we're all grappling for bits of information. Is there a centralized place or repository? Where do we start? And I know a lot of the people on the call today are data privacy officers, people that are managing different elements of a business's risk. Where does one start to find this out?
To find out the laws that are coming into force.
Yeah, and the laws and especially the developments that you just outlined.
Well, there's many different sources that you can use. Obviously, that's a huge part of our job. Don't want to just go in with selling that kind of information, but that's the purpose of the data guidance platform. But you can find a lot of this information online in terms of official reports. The regulator is very active, and data protection authorities globally are very active, but it depends on the authority and the jurisdiction as well. Under some laws, it requires authorities to publish that kind of information. For example, if there's been data breaches of a certain magnitude, as we've seen, there will have to be some kind of public announcement. Specifically, if you can't identify all of the data subjects as well, it's important that there's some kind of general statement that's released.
Thank you. And let's just talk about, we've been talking about South Africa, I think, but let's just talk about the rest of Africa. What examples of data privacy and laws are being implemented across other African regions that may be relevant to our listeners?
Yeah, so several is the answer. It's been very, very busy lately. I don't know if we'd be able to share the slide deck that we've prepared, because we've got quite a nice
video. Please.
We've got a nice map of Africa we can share to support some of the comments I can deliver on this one. So you can see the key there, dark blue. there is a privacy law in effect. Light blue, there's a draft privacy law. Grey, there's no privacy law, right? And what we've been seeing very much over the last 2021 was particularly active, but going back really to kind of 2018 onwards, we've been seeing a massive flurry of laws across Africa. And, Popia in many ways was the genesis of this in Africa, but the GDPR has had a massive impact, right? A lot of the laws that we're seeing are very closely modeled on the GDPR. So we've got laws in Uganda, laws in Rwanda, laws in Kenya, among a few others. And generally, what I would say is that a lot of these laws, they bear a lot of similarities to Popia in the sense that Popia is quite similar to the GDPR also. And
could you also outline some of the differences, perhaps? So there's a similarity between the GDPR and Popia. What are some of the differences where they've perhaps got more lenient or even perhaps more strict?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the requirements that's very common across these laws in Africa is that we have obligatory, mandatory data processing notification with supervisory authorities, which as a kind of starting point to compliance, we don't necessarily see in European laws. In terms of other differences, there's several differences between the laws. Especially, you get a lot of kind of differences in the processes and procedures for complying with data subject rights, for example, which is something that needs to be accounted for in a privacy program. We have different data breach reporting obligations in some cases. We've got a new law in Zimbabwe, for instance, where data breaches need to be reported within 24 hours. And that's a kind of very much shorter and more stringent time frame than we see across some of the laws, a little bit more closely modeled on Popia and the GDPR. But broadly, a lot of the frameworks are quite similar. You have an accountability-based, principle-based regime with a lot of common requirements. Another main difference, I would say, is there's a difference in kind of legal regime maturity with respect to data protection. In a lot of jurisdictions, very recently, we've kind of seen implementing regulations enacted. So I'm thinking here with Uganda, with Kenya, with Nigeria. And what these implementing regulations do is they add a lot of kind of detail to the law and maybe fill in some of the gaps that were missing. So with Nigeria, the law outlines a kind of general principle that you have to appoint a data protection officer or conduct a data protection impact assessment in some cases. What the implementing regulations will do is they will define those requirements and the circumstances in which they apply a little bit more granularly. Similarly, in Uganda, where we've got implementing regulations, we see a lot of these requirements in sharper focus. You're shown a bit more closely like how you need to comply with a lot of the general requirements under the law. And the other thing that implementing regulations do, and in the case of Uganda, this is a good example, is they establish an authority responsible for enforcing the law. So I think there's a difference here between some of the jurisdictions I mentioned where you have slightly more mature regimes with regulations and active authorities. In Rwanda, you also have quite an active authority. And I think that's an indication that you have regulators, you have the framework there ready to regulate and enforce. And for some of these more mature regimes, Nigeria, Uganda, Rwanda, it's time to kind of, get on top of it and understand the more granular differences and implement your privacy programs accordingly.
And Alexis, if I could ask, a lot of this is being driven by the consumer. The consumer is becoming a lot more aware of how their data is being used. They're a lot more aware of the different channels and mediums across which their data is shared. And I think that they're rightly so, are acutely aware of the fact that data centricity is something that threatens them and needs to be honored by businesses. What business trends are we seeing and the behaviors between the business and the customer that perhaps are indicating that relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really valuable point. And, it's quite a complex point. I think another point there is with COVID-19, for example, we've got an increased digitalization of business operations. There's more data to handle. Yeah. And you've also got, like you said, consumers and citizens care more. And I think something that Something that feeds into that, I would say, is consumers in our day and age, I think they see value in more than kind of strictly monetary terms, right? And this doesn't
Yes.
no, it doesn't just apply to privacy. As a business, do you care about the environment? Because as a consumer, I do. How can you show this? And it's the same for privacy, right? How can you show me that you care about privacy? Because I care about my data. And I think, as you say, I mean, that really drives a shift. That shift in consumer mentality kind of necessitates a shift in business mentality. The
And
conversation can no longer be about just compliance. It's about how you can leverage your privacy program to generate trust and create value through that.
and in this digital world, the consumer will walk out the door if they feel that they're not being respected and their data is being abused.
Precisely. Yeah. And I think we briefly touched on the fact of data breaches being more common. Obviously, there's been a big public data breach recently, and I mean these things absolutely drive and accelerate those shifts. I mean, going back further outside the case of Africa, you think of Snowden, you think of Cambridge Analytica, and these moments can really bring up the public consciousness and mean that as a business, you kind of need to get on the right side of it. And not only need to, but there's a lot of value if you can show consumers that, right, I'm accountable for my Popia compliance. I can show you, I have these policies and processes instituted that can show you, the consumer, that I handle data ethically. And
maybe this is a good time to ask a question of Josh and turn it around somewhat and perhaps ask Josh, what are the clients that you're engaging with? How are they behaving differently? What are their expectations at the moment when it comes to the new rules that are being enforced and their attitude towards something that they otherwise perhaps didn't pay much attention to?
Sure. Thanks, James. And hi, everyone. Josh here. As James touched on earlier, more on the commercial side. So part of what I do day to day is, speaking with these prospects and customers of ours, understanding what are some of their biggest challenges at the moment, what things are they concerned about, what's their data privacy strategy for 2022. So really getting into the weeds with them, which is good fun to understand. I'd say something that everyone's kind of mindful of at the moment is the need to balance compliance on the one hand with driving business value on the other hand. How do we be compliant with all these regulations? Because, we want to show our customers and we want them to trust us. If they give us their data, they're doing it in confidence. Nothing's going to get leaked unnecessarily when, we could have had risk mitigation in place. But then also, how do those businesses keep driving the business value from that? How do we market more effectively to these people? Because again, if you can get your products in front of the customer at the right time, that's got real business value and can really differentiate you, as well as, being compliant at the same time. So how do we balance these two paradigms? That's really what I'm chatting about most.
Okay. Thank you. That's important because I think one of the topics I know you were to talk about was trust and openness. And as consumer, we are expecting that behavior. That's definitely a behavior that's being shifted more towards the consumer side because we hold that choice. We don't just hold the product choice in our hands. And what about information, the processing of information, the transfer of information about what you're doing and about the expectation of the customer and about how their data is being managed? Is that quite difficult in the African environment?
Yeah, it is. It is a challenge because, some of these large companies I'm speaking to, they might be multinationals. So we could be in scope of NDPR, the Kenyan DPA, Botswana even has a law as well as everything going on in South Africa. So if you think about, say, a supermarket chain, they're going to have who knows how many third parties that they're going to deal with. What are the risks to those third parties as data processors? Are they looking after our data? Because we're going to need to give them, bits and pieces to do their job. And especially if you've got, you're using software as a service, are those software providers also looking after our customers' data? So it's also about understanding where is your data flowing across the organization? What systems is it going to? And what are the risks involved? And how do we mitigate those risks? Because if we do, and we're open and transparent, it's something the regulator looks really well upon.
Very favorable opinion of the regulator who will hopefully then take you off his dartboard. And I think that, talk about dartboards, I think that complying with privacy laws is absolutely crucial. And we all realize that there's a risk to not. what are some of the measures and what are those sort of enforcements look like? I don't know, Amelia, maybe that's something you could touch on, but I alluded to earlier the fact that we're looking, or the regulator, I say we, not me, are arguably going to have to make an example of someone. What is that going to look like in the near future?
Absolutely, yeah, it's a really key question, and it's something that everyone's asking, because at the end of the day, you can do all of the compliance preparation and make sure that your program is mature as you can, but you need to make sure that you're also not going to be subject to any kind of enforcement action or fines. And that is, for a lot of companies, that's a crucial goal. It is important as well to remember that it's not just about enforcement and fines, it's also about reputational damage and these kind of intangible consequences. And as we're talking about today, the loss of trust from consumers, and you can't necessarily put a number to these, but when you have a really high profile data breach or something like this, sometimes that you can relate a name with this kind of thing, and it can damage this kind of reputation. So
and what about jail term?
Jail time, yeah. So in terms of fines, there's obviously fines, enforcement action, and also jail time in some jurisdictions, and that's something that is really important to remember. For South Africa, we've seen a lot of public statements, as you mentioned, in relation to data breaches, in relation to privacy policies. We've seen them sending letters, conducting a lot of audits, even before they had fully established enforcement powers. Before Popia was commenced, there was a lot of audits for the financial sector, for electronic telecoms providers as well. These kind of key sectors where there's a lot of sensitive personal data. So yeah, these kind of audits taking place, and we haven't actually seen a fine from the regulator yet. And across Africa more widely, I think there's very few examples. There's one from Nigeria under the NDPR. I think that was about 10 million Nigerian naira, but I think that's something like 20,000 euros. But yeah, so we haven't seen so many fines. What we are seeing is what I just mentioned, these kind of enforcement actions, statements, and with that comes a lot of reputational issues. There's a lot of other authorities that are quite active as well. We think about Senegal. They've been releasing reports, quarterly reports for many years, and that details all the companies that have issued, any kind of request for authorizations, the investigations they're carrying out, and also Mauritius as well. I think there's something like 60 investigations happening over the course of 2020 or 2021, and that's increasing every single year, and that's only going to continue to do so as well.
Which it's reassuring for the consumer, but a lot of the people on the call today are interested to know how they can mitigate this risk. And my guess is there's obviously a point at which you need to actually register your organization's commitment to these regulations. Where does one begin? And I don't know if any of you could please take that question.
Yeah, there was a question from the chat about registering information officers, so maybe I can just mention that. For South Africa specifically, there was a hack on the Ministry of Justice which impacted the regulator's website, and that brought down, among other things, the information officers portal. What you can do is they have other sort of aspects, so they have a form that you can fill out and send via email, for example. So there's various other sort of methods that you can use, but the portal itself is still under construction. I think they're trying to put that together. But in terms of registering records, for example, I think I'll hand over maybe to Josh for this in terms of the sort of manual automated aspect.
Okay.
Yeah,
please, Josh.
I think it's all very well, saying we believe in this and this is what we stand for, but what are you doing? Let's see the results. Do you have incident management workflows in place? Are you using any tooling for that? Do you have standardized processes? I think it's really about, if the regulators see, let's see, a record of processing activity, a data map. Do you have one in place? Do you know what's going on? Do you have, individuals who are dedicated to this? I think being, open and transparent about what it is you're actually doing rather than what it is that you're saying is always looked upon favorably by regulators. They're always going to be more lenient if you, are showing that you're being proactive and you're not saying, oh, we had a breach, we're quickly scrambling for a solution. If you can say, look, we have these processes in place, we have a handle on it, we're going to sort it out, they're going to be, okay, well, they do have these very smart systems in place, and we can appreciate that, and we'll work with them to see, what's happened here and how we can improve for the future.
And are people in a position where they can sort of reference use cases and suggest that, unlike brand X, we are doing Y? Or are there more tactical ways of making it clear to the public as to what your angle is?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes, having very clear policies about privacy on your website, making it very clear so anyone can click through, even, something as simple as having a cookie banner. How many, websites when you go on don't have any banner? There's no option to opt in to, functional cookies and opt out of a different type of cookie. Just something as simple as that, maybe with a link to your privacy policy. So if someone wants to see, how their data is being used, it's 2 clicks away. And you've got a whole, people can go as granular as they want on that. So just even really simple things like that. A lot of these biggest organizations, they aren't doing it at the moment. So you can really say, we're leading the way. Like no one's even doing any of these things. We're out on our own here. That's really powerful.
I've got a question in the chat, and someone's asked, considering the African environment and exposure to digital typically through mobile, that's what the question's asking, it doesn't allow for, pages and reams of content and data and privacy laws and policies that one can necessarily consume reliably and justified having understood them. What is the simplest way of engaging with the consumer via mobile in order to gain that trust that you talk about?
Sure. So, I mean, at OneTrust ourselves, we do have something called, mobile app consent, which is a really easy way of embedding similar little banners, policies, links, which can link back into, certain apps even as well. Because, you're right, as you say, it's not simple to link and no one's going to click through on their phone, like in tiny writing and read, a 30-page document.
Yeah.
It's great if they would, but it's not realistic. They're on your phone. You want to get on to the next thing. So I think it's about, I don't think there's an easy answer to that necessarily, but making sure people at least have the option and are aware of their rights and their options is really important. And I think there's a wider educational piece on that as well. And I think as we move to that more data-centric world, people are going to be more and more aware of the rights they have around data privacy. We've certainly seen it in Europe, and it's going to come into Africa very soon. It's a matter of time.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for answering that. One of the things I'm acutely aware of is the expertise that are on this call today, both you as guests, but also the listeners. And I wonder if you give us a picture as to what that sort of level of maturity might look like in South Africa right now, and our respect for Popia.
I think it's important to bear in mind that Popia is still in a relatively new law, and when we talk about this in terms of enforcement as well, and how we haven't necessarily seen a bunch of fines, etc., issued yet, and there's a long way to go, right? It's an ongoing process, both from the regulator and its perspective and for companies' perspective. I think something to bear in mind is when we talk about the idea of, how can I show that I'm compliant? Is there a way to show that I'm certified? Yeah, I mean, there are mechanisms. There's things like codes of conduct, and the other thing with Nigeria, for example, I'm going a bit off piste here. With Nigeria, for example, the regulator there publishes a list of compliant organizations. But in any case, I think the point about Popia, with it being a accountability principle-based regime, is it's a continuous, ongoing, multi-stakeholder endeavor that is requiring continued efforts. It's not an overnight thing, and it's fair and understandable for organizations to need time to adapt their processes and programs towards compliance.
You say that, but Popia was kicked down the road for quite a long time, and there was a hell of a lot of warning that it was coming into effect. We can only ignore things for so long, and even as a despot at the tip of Africa, we need to respect rules and regulations. When they're implemented, we need to be ready to act on them.
Absolutely.
Why are we not ready? Why is there such a lack of maturity? Which I think is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying there's a lack of maturity there, but I think regimes develop as well. We've seen it with the GDPR. As much as you can prepare, there will be further regulation, there will be further guidelines, there will be enforcement activities that guide how you should develop your programs. So without saying that it's an immature phase as such, from the moment of a law coming into force and becoming effective, sure, you can have your programs in place and you've done work towards compliance. My point is more that it's an ongoing effort, and it's not a checkbox thing that you can tick off by the point of it being enacted and enforced, if you follow me. We've seen some guidelines from the information regulator, and it's something that I'm sure will continue to happen, and the requirements under Popia will be further fleshed out. For instance, there's not a lot of information under Popia specifically about how cookie banners operate and such, and how to do that compliantly. These are the kind of things that I'm sure as time goes on and we see more and more regulation, organizations will be given more guidance to get up to speed with that kind of thing. But as you say, there has been time, and in terms of, implementing a comprehensive baseline program, that is something that needs to be done.
Let's look at it from the next level perspective. At some stage we need to start ramping this up, being more efficient, possibly even looking at automating our processes more acutely, identifying how to operationalize the privacy requirements in the best possible way, and actually not just engaging a tick box exercise. Joshua, where do we start with the next level as opposed to what we should have done for the last few years?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, James. And I think to set the scene, if we could just get the slides back up. It's 2022. We've got tons of SaaS systems, so software as a service. They've got tons of data flowing in, flowing out, huge volumes of information within these data lakes. The amount, I've touched on it earlier, but the amount of data that's being processed and shared with third parties or consumed from third parties, it's ever increasing. So we've got this larger velocity, volume of information that we've just not seen before. The scale is pretty unprecedented, and it's creating different challenges. There's opportunities here, but there's also risks that we face from the use or the misuse of data. They're really significant. So within that, for example, there might be hidden data that you may not even be aware of in your organization. So information that third parties have shared with you that you didn't necessarily need to collect, information your customers have given you or somehow stored with you, information employees may have captured. So say in free text fields on your CRM, just as an example. So there's loads of ways this information can build up, and ultimately it can lead to toxic combinations of information. So it opens the door to inferred data or inferred conclusions based off of data, and that can create confidentiality, maybe sensitivity issues that are totally unintended. They're just a direct result of data not being used properly. At OneTrust, with the background that we have, we're highly aware of the risks from a compliance perspective. There might be multiple compliance risks across various laws. So it might just not be data protection, but, e-privacy laws, sector-specific laws. I know on the call today, we've got, a strong turnout from, I'm sure, the finance industry, the insurance industry. That doesn't surprise me at all. So there's all these, sector-specific laws that might come into play as well. The more data you have, the more places you're storing information without a proper data governance program, the higher the potential for a data breach. And an obvious example just recently came out of South Africa, with, data you certainly don't want being hacked or leaked out to third parties. And really, it creates a business problem. And I touched on this earlier as well. We've talked about, I just spoke on the risks of mass processing data, but, you need to have information because consumers and customers expect you to leverage this data to improve their experience and, to continue to innovate, provide efficiencies. You only have to look at a company like Amazon on how efficient they make things at the moment. That allows, you as an organization to understand them better, understand the market better, improve your products, and, knowing your customer, it's really important. So creating that tailored experience is a real key factor here. So leveraging the information to innovate and to grow, because again, your customers expect you to be the best because, that's why they're with you. And I'm sure your competitors are all kind of looking at it at the moment. So just want to pause there if there's any questions that have come in just on that initial issue.
Thanks. Looking at the chat, I see no more questions from the audience.
Cool.
But I can certainly ask a question around the fact that if one is trying to, and I know your next slide is a seesaw and trying to talk about the balance between business value and compliance. Maybe you want to talk a bit more about that, because I think we all realize there's a risk to not, but there's also a risk in how you deliver your compliance. Could we bring
absolutely.
up those next few slides, please?
Let's skip ahead to that. You're right, because you don't want to be going all business value, because then you're cutting corners on protecting data and the compliance side of things. But at the same time, if you're just all heavy compliance, it's really hard to be really involved with your customers and leading the market, because your competitors might be still compliant, but they're also pushing ahead with pitching the right products at the right time. So trying to find that balance is difficult. And as we're doing, with COVID having come in, there's more and more digital transformation than ever. And again, expectations, they're only going to go up, aren't they? So there is friction here, but what we want to do is unify all these efforts and processes to reduce that friction, be efficient, be intelligent, keep your risks low, but make sure there's no unnecessary bureaucracy that's just slowing things down and getting you bogged down. And with large companies, that's often the case. So again, if you're organized, it's very helpful.
Yeah, I'm immediately thinking here, we've talked about the what, the why. I think there's an element of how that we should get to, because expertise, experience, action. The action that you've just illustrated is trying to balance that seesaw, but maybe that's a time and effort and a skills focus as well, where we need to be making sure we've got the right skills to bring those expertise and experiences to balance things out. But what else do we need to make sure that we continue to add value whilst actually taking action, both in the delivery of value and compliance?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think really it starts with, knowing your data. Put simply, what information do I have? But it's more than just that. It's where is that data flowing? How is it being processed? Who's leveraging it? Who's accessing it? Are they the appropriate people who should be having access to this information? This is often the background to a data discovery project. And again, this is where privacy automation, which is really the cutting edge of where things stand in this respect, is kind of coming at things from. So understanding the data holistically from a Popia perspective or NDPR perspective. And also, is it in scope of other regulations? So we touched on financial services, healthcare is another huge one, retail. What requirements do we have? So that's kind of what I would say in terms of, how organizations are moving about this and how they're trying to bridge that gap between the two.
Okay. So it's quite a manual process. Thank you. And I'm glad you say automation privacy, because it's typically quite a manual process. And I think a lot of the skills are in-house or third party and relied on for a body of work. That's certainly the experience that I've found. A similar conversation. How do we create that fully automated program?
Sure. No, it makes perfect sense.
Maybe I'm jumping ahead.
Yeah, you've jumped the gun there.
Have I?
No, perfect. Let's get into it.
Please.
I agree. Let's take a quick example of this in practice, because I want to get practical with you guys. I don't want to make this a lecture. So hypothetically, let's say we've got a business that wants to use customer data for a new purpose that you didn't originally collect it for. So maybe you have a business analyst, they're looking through a data catalog, they find a data set they want to use, and they submit the data usage request. Now, this could ultimately trigger a process to create a privacy impact assessment, because you're processing this information or using it for a different purpose than you initially collected it for. So a PIA is needed. Now, you can ultimately go and check your records of processing for the legal basis for processing that information. And depending on what that legal basis is, it might mean you need to update policies related to the data that's being processed. So maybe you needing to modify what that legal basis is. And then maybe if it's changed, you might need to get updated consent before you use it for that new purpose. So once the PIA is approved for privacy, updates have been made, access can be given, but you might also be able to only get access to any data that you've collected after those updates because of the new purpose of processing. So what we're trying to do is automatically be able to go into your systems, find what we need to find, conduct that assessment, and then you get the outcome, rather than one person searching, who knows how many systems to find that relevant bit of information to make sure you're doing this in a compliant way.
Correct. And that's usually too late, because that's an auditor.
Exactly. The auditor's going to be looking at that saying, well, hang on, what's happened here? And then it's, I'm not sure what happened. We can't remember. I don't even remember who the person who did it left the company. all sorts of things could have happened by then. And then, it becomes an issue. So yeah, really what we do first is, scanning. If we just take it back a step, once we attach basically connectors or worker nodes, scan through all the data that you have. So it could be across structured, unstructured systems, cloud-based, on-prem, depending on where the information is sitting. So those connectors connect to the data sources themselves, and they'll scan, classify, and categorize the information that's contained within them. So from there, we can, automatically create a metadata catalog of the various sort of data inventories across an organization. So basically, once you have that understanding across all your different, data assets, your different vendors and third parties that are providing them, and what are the specific data elements that are being processed, so the types of, consumer or data subject information that you have, you can pull in the technical metadata. So you can see the full database, the table, the column, the data element that's located. And again, you'll be able to kind of see that in a much more visual way than it's, letters and numbers and endless spreadsheets and tables. Really, you want to have a centralized system.
Yeah, can I ask, is that a database or a data board or a dashboard that just radiates information out at me, telling me where my risks are, so I can perhaps stem that flood sooner than it becomes too drastic?
So what we've typically seen is, you've got all these data lakes all over the place with different systems. And what we do is by scanning everything, put it into a centralized dashboard. You can see what risks are flagged from what areas of the business. And say you've got a Salesforce or an Excel or whatever it is, you can say these are the risks that have been flagged with these based on what we've scanned from those systems. And having that centralized dashboard, it's really nice for reporting. You can just run a quick report, 30 minutes, you can have something to hand to your CISO and say, this is where we're at with all our data. Okay, we need to have a little bit of a look in this system because we've seen some things that look odd to us. The data quality is not perfect. We'll go in there and flag that up before, we actually get to a point where there's an incident and it needs our attention. Let's get ahead of it. And automation allows you to do that, rather than if it was all manual processing, you're going to have to get who knows how many employees to go searching all these areas. And to be able to, get that and find that information in a timely manner is now impossible with the amount, just the sheer volumes of data that are being processed.
Thank you. You're definitely reassuring me of the fact that, lagging indicators are only going to cost us more money to rectify.
Absolutely. And again, it's one of those things where if you have, a solution that you've built with your team or you've outsourced it, these things can, again, it's the power of these solutions is it's hard for a human brain to compute how quickly they're doing and searching and sifting and sorting, just because our minds don't scale very well. But when you see it in action, it's something to see.
Reminds you of that old adage, we're not robots.
Yeah, no, it's one of those where I think, it sounds cool, but then when you actually understand how much data they're going through, it's mind-boggling.
Okay. Joshua, thank you for explaining that. And I don't know if Alexis or Amelia, I don't know if you'd like to close off on anything, but I've certainly got a few things I'd like to say.
Yeah, I can just add a final sort of statement putting together.
Please.
I guess me and Lex were speaking a bit about the range of compliance requirements that there are, not just in South Africa, but across Africa as well, and how it links a little bit with the EU requirements as well, especially for multinational organizations. So I think it's important to understand that there is a lot to comply with. There's a lot of timelines. There's a lot that needs to be done. And it's not all necessarily explained under the laws as well. They're obviously principle-based laws. As we mentioned, it's not they don't provide a checklist of everything that you need to do. It needs to be sort of catered to your organization, your sector, your size, many different other factors as well. So it's really important to have the right process in place. And then, as Josh discussed, making sure that you're doing those processes in the most efficient way too. So that's sort of my...
Okay. Thank you, Amelia. Alexis?
Not a whole bunch to add further to that, but I think something like generally like a key takeaway that I'd kind of like to add for everyone here is that the consumer mentality and the consequent shift towards enacting more and more laws and there being more stringent regulations is not something that's going to slow down or stop All these rules are going to, they're going to become more and more pervasive to business, and having, like we say, having the processes in place to make sure that we can actually leverage that towards value, and shifting that needle from the needle of the conversation from, a burdensome compliance effort to something that we can actually work towards to build our brand, to build our reputation and mitigate against risk. It's something that we all need to be thinking about.
I love that. Thank you, Alexis, for bringing the positivity to it, because I think you're absolutely right. There are obviously some cons and challenges, but definitely some pros to doing this. And what I've definitely, just as by means of a summary for our listeners and the audience, so please, and I guess, so please correct me, but I've definitely got a number of key takeaways from today's conversation. I'm very clear that there's an expanding regulatory environment that I need to be acutely aware of. I can't do it by myself necessarily. I'm going to slip up. I'm going to miss things. I'm also aware that the data is something that grows rapidly. The landscape grows rapidly. The access to data, the use of data, and the use of technology is something that I need to definitely bring to the fore in order to manage that environment as best I can. And also, I need to clearly balance the difference between being overly burdened by governance and actually creating value in my business. If anything, as a business owner, I'm going to err on the side of the seesaw rocking in the opposite direction towards business value and my customers. But we do need to find that healthy balance. So I've thoroughly enjoyed today's conversation. The team at OneTrust, Alexis, Amelia, and Joshua, thank you very, very, very much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your insights into this topic. Thank you for bringing a different angle somewhat from just the South African context. So from me, James Erasmus at Tech Central, I thank you all very, very much. And I wonder if, Joshua, if you'd like to just leave us with any last thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, James. And again, your summary kind of stole mine a little bit, but again, it was, which means it's good. I mean, we must have got, communicated something, but yeah, I mean, the regulatory environment's expanding, the data landscape's, it's changing, technology is, updating and being upgraded all the time, avoiding the false paradigm of privacy versus innovation. If you remember the 3 key things from this webinar, I think that would, hopefully, serve you well going forward. Myself, Lex, or Amelia, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or any feedback from us. We're always looking to learn and improve. Now, if you want to find out more about OneTrust or data guidance, again, we can provide you with any links there to, find out more about what we do. But I really want to thank you for your time as well and attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Thanks, team. And from us at Tech Central, thank you for joining us.